Mississippi, 1859. They sold the boy as if he were already half gone. The auctioneer called him small for his years. Another man said he looked tired in the eyes. Someone laughed and said he would not last a season alone. The boy stood barefoot on the boards and listened, his hands folded, his face still. He did not argue. He did not cry. He watched who spoke, who nodded, and who looked away. By sundown, he belonged to no one who planned to watch him closely. They sent him south of the fields, past the fence line, to a place where the ground flooded and the wind did not carry voices back. They thought they had sold a burden. They thought nature would finish what they did not. No one asked what a child learns when survival is his only companion, and silence is his teacher. The auction took place beneath a sky that refused to decide whether it would rain. Clouds pressed low over the Mississippi yard, thick and gray, holding back the sun as if even the day itself wished to look away. Wooden boards creaked beneath the weight of boots and expectation. Men gathered in small knots, hands folded behind backs or hooked into belts, speaking in half, voices that carried more judgment than curiosity. The boy stood apart from the others. He was young, no more than 12, though his body suggested fewer years. His shoulders were narrow, his arms thin as switch branches. The linen shirt hanging from him had once belonged to someone larger. The sleeves were rolled twice, the collar loose. His feet were bare, pressed flat against the boards, toes gripping unconsciously, as if the ground itself might disappear. He did not look up when they called his number. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke with the careful tone reserved for items of uncertain value. "This one here." He began, tapping the ledger with a finger, who's said to be weak in constitution. Not built for heavy labor, quiet sort. A man near the front squinted. "How old?" "Hard to say," the auctioneer replied. "Likely older than he appears. Slow to grow, they tell me." The boy listened. He always listened. He had learned long ago that words spoken about him were never meant for him, but they often decided his fate. He kept his face smooth, eyes lowered, breathing steady. He did not shift his weight when someone circled him, did not flinch when fingers briefly lifted his chin, and then let it fall again. "Does he know any trade?" Another voice asked. "Not worth mentioning," the auctioneer said. "Can fetch water, 10 small tasks. Nothing that'll strain him too much." A low chuckle passed through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He won't last long in the fields." Another replied, "Best suited for the house, maybe. Or nowhere at all." The boy absorbed each word, storing them away like stones in his pocket. Heavy, but useful. He noticed which men spoke loudly and which stayed quiet. He noticed who studied him and who dismissed him at once. Most important of all, he noticed the tone, not cruelty sharpened into anger, but something colder, certainty. Certainty that he was already decided. The bidding was brief. No competition, no raised voices. A single hand lifted, half-hearted, more out of convenience than desire. The price settled low, lower than the boy understood numbers to reach. The gavel came down with a dull sound that echoed longer than it should have. "Sold," the auctioneer said, closing the ledger. Just like that, the crowd began to thin. Men turned away, conversations already shifting to other matters. Cotton yields, river levels, the weather. The boy remained where he was, waiting to be told where to stand next. He did not ask. Asking invited answers one did not want. The man who had bought him approached slowly. He was not unkind looking, but his eyes held the distracted gaze of someone who considered the purchase finished the moment it was made. He glanced at the boy once, then spoke to the auctioneer instead. "I'll have him sent down to the low parcel," he said. "No sense keeping him where he'll slow others." The auctioneer nodded. "That land floods." "So I've heard." The boy felt a tightening in his chest at the word floods, though he kept his face still. He knew that land. Everyone did. It lay beyond the fence line, where the soil stayed dark and soft even in dry months, where insects rose in clouds at dusk and the air carried a damp, sour smell. It was not a place meant for children, or anyone meant to be watched. The man finally turned to him. "You walk when told?" "Yes, sir," the boy answered quietly. His voice surprised the man, if only slightly. It was steady, not weak. Still, the man said nothing more. He gestured to another worker, older, with shoulders bent by years rather than age. "Take him there. Give him what's needed. We'll see how long he manages." The boy followed without protest. As they walked away from the yard, the sounds of the auction faded. Boots, laughter, the crack of voices bargaining over other lives. The path narrowed. Grass grew taller. The fence posts thinned until there were none at all. With every step, the boy felt something closing behind him, like a door gently pushed shut. The older man finally spoke. "You best not expect much help out there." "I understand," the boy said. The man glanced down at him. "Most don't." They walked on. What no one noticed, what no one cared to notice, was the way the boy's eyes moved. How he counted steps without moving his lips. How he noted the bend of the land, the direction of water runoff, the places where the ground dipped and where it rose. He listened to the birds and to the silence between their calls. He felt the wind and remembered where it came from. They had sold him as weak. They had named him broken. They had decided his end before his beginning. But as the low land came into view, the boy did not think of ending. He thought of learning. And that was the first mistake they made. The ledger was kept in a narrow office with a single window that faced east. In the early morning, light crept across the desk in a thin band, revealing dust motes and the faded ink of names written long before the boy arrived. The clerk who sat there prided himself on neat columns and straight lines. Though his hand cramped easily and his patience wore thin by midday, he did not know the boy's name. That was the first omission. When the order came through, brief, spoken rather than written, the clerk paused only long enough to dip his pen. "The small one," the messenger had said, "sent to the low parcel, not fit for regular work." The clerk nodded and wrote what he believed to be sufficient. Age 15. Condition I poured. Assignment overflow land, south stretch. He did not ask further questions. He had copied such entries hundreds of times. One more made little difference. Ink dried. Pages turned. And with that, the boy became something less than seen. A line on paper that would not be checked again for months, perhaps longer. By late afternoon, the boy was taken down the rutted path that led toward the low parcel. The older man left him at the edge of the land with a sack, a tin cup, and instructions spoken as if they were already forgotten. Stay clear of the deeper water. Don't wander north. If the ground goes soft, turn back. Yes, sir, the boy said. The man hesitated, then added, someone will come by. The boy knew better than to ask when. When the man's footsteps faded, the quiet settled heavily around him. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by reeds, shallow pools, and the dark line of trees marking the river's bend. There was a small structure nearby, if it could be called that, a leaning shed made of mismatched boards, its roof patched with old tin. The door hung crooked, barely closing. The boy set down the sack and stood still. He waited. Waiting had always served him better than moving too soon. He listened to the sounds of the place, the slow movement of water beneath grass, insects rising and falling, the distant call of a bird he did not recognize. He watched how the light changed the color of the ground, how shadows marked firmer soil from places that would swallow a foot whole. Only after this did he step forward. Inside the shed, there was little. A broken stool, a coil of rope stiff with age, 2 tools left behind without care, a dull blade and a wooden-handled spade, its edge chipped but usable. He ran his thumb carefully along the grain of the handle, testing for cracks. Tools, he knew, were often truer than people. The mistake in the ledger had already begun its work. Because the clerk had written him older than he was, no one thought to check on him as a child. Because he was marked as weak, no one expected productivity. Because the land was considered difficult, oversight was rare. The boy existed now in a space where neglect and assumption met and canceled each other out. Days passed without visitors. On the first night, rain came. Not hard, but steady. The boy moved his few things to higher ground inside the shed, stacking the sack beneath the stool, turning the tin cup upside down so it would not fill. He stayed awake, listening to the water rise and settle, memorizing the sound it made when it touched the threshold. In the morning, he checked the marks he had scratched on a post with the edge of the blade. The water had risen less than he feared. He nodded to himself. Hunger followed predictably. The sack held only enough to last a short while, if used carefully. The boy ate slowly, chewing longer than necessary, letting his body feel full before it was. He remembered which plants had been pointed out to him long ago as safe, which insects gathered where the ground stayed dry. He tested nothing without watching first. Observation, he had learned, was safer than strength. Each day, he mapped the land in his mind. He noted where animals moved without sinking, where birds fed, where the ground cracked when it dried, revealing what lay beneath. He repaired the shed as best he could, fitting boards tighter, weighting the tin with stones. He did not rush. No one came. Back at the main house, the ledger sat closed. The clerk assumed the boy was where he belonged. The man who purchased him assumed the land would decide his usefulness soon enough. Others assumed the same. Assumptions are quiet things. They do not shout. They simply remain. Weeks passed. The boy grew leaner, but his movements grew surer. His hands learned the weight of the spade. His feet learned which paths would hold. When storms came, he prepared early. When the heat pressed down, he worked at dawn and dusk, resting when the sun stood highest. He learned that survival did not announce itself. It showed in small, careful choices repeated without witness. One afternoon, distant voices drifted across the land. The boy froze, then lowered himself into the reeds. He watched as 2 men walked the far edge, pointing at the waterline. "Nothing grows right here," one said. "Never does," the other replied. "No point sending anyone down long term." They left without looking closer. The boy waited until their voices faded before standing again. He understood then what the ledger mistake truly meant. Not freedom, not safety. Time unmeasured, time unnoticed, and in that unnoticed time, the boy did not waste a single moment. No one taught the boy how to survive the low parcel. There were no instructions written down, no rules spoken more than once, no hands guiding his own. What he had instead was time, quiet, and the habit of paying attention. These were the things that shaped him. At first, he moved little. He spent long hours sitting near the edge of the higher ground, knees drawn up, watching the land behave as if it had no interest in him at all. The marsh did not rush. It changed slowly, almost politely, revealing its intentions only to those patient enough to notice. Water crept where it would. Grass bent in patterns that told him which way the wind preferred to travel. Insects gathered in certain places at certain hours, avoiding others without explanation. The boy watched everything. He learned the morning by its sounds before the light fully arrived. Birds began first, then insects, then the faint movement of water settling after the night's cooling. By the time the sun reached the tops of the trees, he already knew which parts of the land would hold its weight that day, and which would not. The ground spoke in subtle ways, through smell and texture, through the way mud clung or released. He tested his knowledge carefully. When he walked, he placed his feet where animals did. Hoofprints and narrow tracks became his guides. If a place bore no sign of passage, he avoided it. He carried the spade not as a tool of labor at first, but as a probe, pressing its handle into the soil ahead of him to measure firmness before stepping forward. He never trusted still water. Stillness, he knew, often hid depth. He learned from failure as well, though he allowed himself only small ones. A foot sinking a few inches taught him where not to step again. A slipped grip on the spade taught him how to wrap cloth around the handle. He did not curse his mistakes. He stored them. Food required observation above all else. The boy watched what ate and what was eaten. He noted which birds pecked at the ground and returned again, which insects were ignored by everything else. He remembered lessons spoken long ago by older voices. Warnings passed down quietly, as if naming danger too loudly might invite it closer. He tried nothing without watching first, sometimes for days. When he did take food, he took little. Enough to quiet his body, not enough to dull his senses. Hunger sharpened his attention. Fullness made him careless. This was something he learned quickly and never forgot. The shed became more than shelter. It became a record. He marked the posts with thin scratches. 1 for each day the water rose. 2 for each day it fell. He scratched symbols only he understood to mark, where the ground stayed firm longest, where insects vanished before rain, where the wind shifted before storms. The marks were faint. To anyone else, they would have meant nothing. To him, they were a map. He watched the sky with the same care. Clouds moved differently over the lowland. Some brought brief relief. Others pressed down and lingered. He learned to smell rain before it arrived, to hear it in the way insects went silent. When storms came, he was ready. Not with panic, but with preparation. He moved his things early, secured the shed, chose where to wait. Waiting was a skill he had practiced all his life. In the afternoons, when the heat forced even insects into hiding, the boy rested and listened. He learned the sounds of animals moving unseen. He could tell the difference between something passing through and something hunting. He learned when to stay still and when movement was safer than silence. What he did not do was draw attention. He kept the land looking as neglected as it was meant to be. He did not clear too much. He did not build anything that could be seen from a distance. Order existed only where it served him, and nowhere else. He understood that being noticed brought questions, and questions brought people. People brought change. Once, a man appeared at the far edge of the parcel, walking slowly, as if already bored. The boy saw him long before the man saw anything worth noticing. He lowered himself into the reeds and watched the man poke the ground with his boot, shake his head, and turn away. The boy did not move until the sound of footsteps disappeared entirely. Later he returned to his quiet work, heart steady. Each day, the boy grew more certain, not of safety, but of understanding. The land was not kind, but it was honest. It did not lie to him. It responded the same way each time, if approached with care. People, he had learned, changed without warning. The land did not. His body changed as well. His movements became economical, his strength measured. He learned when to push and when to stop. He learned that endurance was not a single act, but 1,000 small choices made correctly. At night, he lay awake listening to the water and the distant life of the place. He thought of nothing grand. No escape. No revenge. Those were loud thoughts, and loud thoughts invited mistakes. Instead, he thought of patterns. How long it took the ground to dry after rain. How many steps it took to reach safety from each point. How much food his body truly needed. How little he could survive on without becoming reckless. By the time the season began to shift, The boy was no longer simply surviving the low parcel. He understood it. And because he understood it, he belonged to it in a way no one else did. Not by ownership, not by choice, but by knowledge earned in silence. No one had taught him. No one had expected him to learn. And that, more than anything else, was why he did. The first time someone truly watched him, the boy knew before he was seen. The air carried a change. Not in sound, but in pressure, the way it did when a storm gathered beyond sight. He paused with the spade held loosely in his hands and listened. Distant voices drifted across the low parcel. Men speaking without urgency. The sound of boots meeting ground that did not welcome them. He did not hurry. Hurrying made a person visible. Instead, he let his shoulders slump slightly, allowed his stance to soften. When the men came into view at the edge of the higher ground, he bent again to his task, digging slowly, clumsily, as if each movement required more effort than it should. The men stopped and watched. One of them was the man who had purchased him. The other was younger, his hat set straighter, his eyes sharper. They spoke quietly, not expecting the boy to hear. "That's him," the owner said. "Doesn't look any stronger than I remember." The younger man studied the boy's thin frame, the way he paused between movements. "He's still alive." "Barely," the owner replied. "This land doesn't keep much." The boy kept his eyes on the soil. He let the spade catch awkwardly, scraping instead of cutting. He adjusted his grip, as if unsure how to hold it properly. When he lifted the dirt, some of it spilled back into the hole. A small failure, offered carefully. They watched longer. "He's slow," the younger man said. "Maybe too slow to be useful anywhere else." "That was my thinking," the owner replied. "If he lasts the season, it's more than expected." The boy's chest tightened, but his breathing remained steady. He did not straighten. He did not show the strength he had gained, the precision in his movements when unobserved. He understood something important in that moment, something the land had already taught him. Expectation was a tool, and like any tool, it could be turned. When the men approached, the boy wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt across his skin. He did not look up right away. "You managing?" the owner asked, not unkindly, not kindly either. "Yes, sir," the boy said. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "What have you been doing all day?" The boy hesitated, just long enough to seem unsure. "Digging where the ground's softer, like I was told." The younger man snorted softly. "That ground's always soft." The boy nodded as if accepting a correction. He did not argue. The owner looked around. The land appeared as neglected as ever. No cleared paths, no visible improvements. The shed still leaned. The boy still looked small. "Food holding out?" the owner asked. The boy shrugged. "I eat little." Another truth offered without detail. The men exchanged a glance. There was nothing remarkable here. No problem requiring attention. No reason to change anything. "That'll do," the owner said finally. "Keep at it." "Yes, sir." They left the way they came, their footsteps fading into the reeds. The boy waited until the land swallowed their presence again. Only then did he straighten his back. Only then did he move with purpose. He returned to the work he had been doing before they arrived. Not digging, but reinforcing the ground near the shed, placing stones beneath the soil to improve drainage. It was careful work, slow but effective. Work that left little trace from a distance. He smiled faintly, not from joy, but from understanding. That visit had been a test, though the men had not known it. They had come expecting to see either failure or usefulness. What they did not expect was control. The boy had chosen what they saw. From that day on, he practiced this skill deliberately. When someone approached, he worked slower. When voices carried, he allowed mistakes. When watched, He became exactly what they expected: fragile, uncertain, unimpressive. He saved his true effort for times when the land was his only witness. It required discipline. There were days when his body felt strong, when he could have shown speed or skill. Those were the hardest days. To appear weak when strength is available requires restraint. To hide competence is more difficult than to lack it. But he remembered the words spoken at the auction: weak, slow, unfit. Those words had bought him time. He would not give that time back easily. Once, a tool broke while he worked alone. The handle cracked clean through. He repaired it with care, fitting the pieces together, binding them tightly. The next day, knowing someone might pass by, he loosened the binding slightly so the tool would wobble in his hands if seen. Appearances mattered. Another time, he allowed his clothing to remain worn and ill-fitted, though he could have mended it neatly. Neatness suggested attention. Attention suggested questions. Questions led to change. The land, too, played its part. It covered his careful work with mud and water, hid his improvements beneath reeds and grass. Together, they formed a quiet agreement. He would not reveal more than necessary, and the land would keep his secrets. He listened closely to every word spoken near him. He learned who assumed what, who cared enough to notice, and who did not care at all. He learned that most people saw what they expected, and little else. This knowledge steadied him more than food. By the end of that season, the boy had passed the quiet test without anyone marking it as such. He had proven not his strength, but his understanding, not his endurance, but his patience. They believed he survived despite himself. In truth, he survived because he knew when not to be seen. The storms came earlier than usual that year. The boy sensed the change before the sky showed it. The air grew heavier, pressing low against the land, dulling sound and slowing movement. Insects vanished from places they normally gathered. Birds fed quickly, and then disappeared into the trees long before dusk. The water in the shallow pools stopped retreating at night, and began to linger. He marked the shed post with a longer scratch than usual. Storm season meant more than rain. It meant isolation. The paths that allowed passage through the low parcel would soon dissolve into mud and water. What little distance existed between him and the rest of the world would stretch wider, not by miles, but by danger. Once the storm settled in, no one would come. Not out of concern, out of inconvenience. The boy prepared without haste. He moved what little food he had to the highest place inside the shed. He tightened the boards again, adding weight where the wind had tested them before. He dug narrow channels to guide water away from the door, shaping them with care so they would not draw attention if someone passed later. Each task was done quietly, deliberately. The first storm arrived in the night. Rain fell steadily, not violent, but persistent. The boy lay awake, listening to the water speak to the land. He knew its language now. He could tell when it met resistance and when it found weakness, when it pooled, when it crept. By morning, the ground near the shed was slick, but holding. He stepped outside carefully, testing each place before committing his weight. The land was changing, but not beyond what he had expected. He adjusted his markings. He adjusted his plans. The second storm came harder. Wind pushed rain sideways, rattling the tin roof until it sang a thin, uneven song. The boy sat with his back against the strongest wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped loosely around them. He did not panic. Panic wasted energy, and energy would be needed. When water reached the threshold, he did not rush to move. He waited. He watched the level rise, slow, and stop just below the doorframe. The channels held. The stones beneath the soil did their work. He allowed himself one slow breath. Days blurred into one another. Rain fell, stopped, and returned. The sky remained gray, heavy with clouds that never fully emptied themselves. The land stayed wet, refusing to dry. The boy rationed carefully. Each mouthful was measured, each movement considered. Hunger grew familiar. So did silence. With the storms came complete separation. No voices. No distant footsteps. No signs of life beyond the marsh itself. The boy existed alone with the land, bound to it more completely than ever before. At times fear pressed in, not sharp but dull and persistent. He acknowledged it without letting it guide him. Fear, like hunger, could sharpen the senses if kept in its place. One afternoon, the rain stopped suddenly. The quiet that followed was almost unsettling. The boy stepped outside and scanned the land. Water stood everywhere, reflecting the pale sky. The paths he once used were gone, swallowed by shallow pools that disguised depth and danger. He did not attempt to cross them. Instead, he stayed close to the shed, moving only where he was certain. He used the spade handle to test the ground, the same way he always had. The storm had not changed his methods. It had only demanded more care. That night, another storm rolled in, this one stronger than the rest. Wind tore at the reeds, flattening them in waves. Rain fell hard enough to sting skin. Water rose faster than before. The boy moved his few belongings higher, climbing onto the stool when the floor grew slick. He held onto the wall with one hand, the spade with the other. The shed groaned but held. Hours passed. Time lost its shape. At some point, exhaustion threatened to pull him into sleep, and with it, danger. He forced himself to stay awake by counting breaths, heartbeats, scratches on the wall. He sang nothing. He spoke nothing. Sound carried strangely in storms. When morning came, it arrived quietly. The boy stepped down carefully. The water had receded just enough to make movement possible. He surveyed the damage. Some of the channels had collapsed. He repaired them slowly, working through fatigue with steady hands. It was then he realized the truth of the storm season. This was not something to endure briefly. This was something to live through. The storms would return, again and again. There would be no rescue, no relief. Survival would depend on consistency, not courage. So he settled into the rhythm of it. He worked when the rain allowed. He rested when the heat followed. He ate sparingly. He drank carefully. He learned which storms brought danger and which brought only discomfort. He learned how long the water would stay after each kind of rain. The land tested him constantly, not with sudden cruelty, but with relentless demand. And the boy answered quietly. By the time the storms began to weaken, his body was thinner, but his movements were sure. His mind had grown steadier, his patience deeper. He no longer measured time in days, but in changes. Water lines, cloud patterns, the return of certain birds. When at last the sky cleared for good, the low parcel looked as it always had to anyone passing by, wet, unproductive, forgotten. But hidden beneath that appearance was proof. The boy had survived alone through the storm season. Not by strength, not by chance, by knowing when to move and when to wait. The chance came quietly, as most dangerous chances do. It arrived on a morning when the land lay still, washed clean by the last of the storms. The air was clearer than it had been in weeks, the sky pale and open, as if nothing bad had ever lingered there. The boy noticed the change at once. Clear mornings meant movement. Clear mornings meant people remembered paths they had avoided. He was repairing one of the channels near the shed when he heard it. The faint sound of voices carried by dry air. He froze. Not with fear, but with calculation. The voices were not close, but they were not distant either. 2 men, perhaps 3. Their steps were careless, unhurried. This was not a search. This was routine. The kind of visit that happened after long neglect, when curiosity finally outweighed indifference. The boy straightened slowly and looked toward the far edge of the parcel. The water had receded enough to reveal a narrow strip of firm ground leading north. He had noticed it days ago, but said nothing to himself about it. Naming such things gave them power. That strip, if followed carefully, would connect to higher land beyond the fence line. From there, roads, woods, movement, escape. The idea did not rush him. It settled instead, heavy and quiet. He stood still and measured the moment. The men's voices drifted closer, then paused. Laughter carried briefly, careless and loud. They were not watching the ground closely. They assumed the land would slow anyone foolish enough to cross it. The boy knew better. He could go now. He could slip into the reeds, follow the narrow strip while the ground still held, vanish into places where no ledger reached and no one bothered to count. He knew how to move unseen. He had practiced it every day of his life. For the first time since he arrived at the low parcel, the path forward opened without immediate danger. And still, he did not move. Instead, he crouched slowly and pressed his hand into the soil, feeling its resistance. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the voices, but to his own breathing, to the steady rhythm that had carried him through storms and hunger and silence. He thought carefully. Running was not a single act. It was a series of risks, each one compounding the next. Roads meant people. People meant questions. Questions meant attention. Attention, he knew, was more dangerous than any storm. He had no papers, no name that would be believed. His body, thin and marked by labor, would speak before his mouth ever could. He had seen what happened to those who ran without preparation. Their stories ended quickly, often without words. Here in the low parcel, he was unseen but known just enough to be forgotten. That was a kind of protection. The voices came closer. One of the men stepped onto softer ground and cursed as his boot sank. Another laughed. Place is useless, one said. Always has been. Should have let the boy go. Another replied. If he's still here. The boy lowered his head and let his shoulders round. He stepped back into view slowly, deliberately, carrying the spade at an awkward angle. He did not look toward the strip of firm ground again. That choice had already been made. When the men noticed him, there was mild surprise, nothing more. Well, one said, you're still breathing. Yes, sir, the boy answered. Thought the storms might have finished you. The boy shrugged faintly. I stayed where it was higher. The men looked around, uninterested. They did not notice the channels. They did not see the stones beneath the soil. They saw only what they expected, a thin boy standing in bad land. That strip there, one man said, pointing vaguely north. You ever think of heading that way? The boy shook his head slowly. Ground's tricky. A truth, offered plainly. The men grunted in agreement. Best stay put. Yes, sir. They spoke a few more words, none of them important. Then they turned back the way they came, boots sucking at the ground, voices fading once again into nothing. The boy remained where he was long after they left. His heart beat steadily. His hands did not shake. Only when the land was quiet again did he allow himself to sit. He knew what he had given up. He also knew what he had kept. By choosing not to run, he kept control. He kept predictability. He kept the one thing that had allowed him to survive every test so far: time. Time to observe. Time to learn. Time to wait for a moment that did not demand recklessness. That night, he lay awake longer than usual. The thought of the open path returned again and again, testing him the way hunger once had. He did not push it away. He examined it, measured it, and set it aside. Some escapes were loud. Some were permanent. He understood now that survival was not always about leaving. Sometimes it was about staying exactly where no one thought to look. When morning came, the strip of firm ground remained unchanged. It would be there again another day, perhaps stronger, perhaps weaker. He did not rush toward it. Instead, he returned to his work, patient as ever. The choice not to run did not make him smaller. It made him dangerous in a way no one could see. The return was not announced. It never was, in places like the low parcel. Men did not arrive with purpose there. They came because something elsewhere had failed, because fields had flooded, because labor was short, because someone remembered an entry in a ledger and wondered, briefly, if it still applied. The boy noticed signs before he heard voices. The land carried unfamiliar weight. Footprints pressed deeper than usual into the firmer paths. Reeds bent where they normally stood untouched. The boy paused and studied the marks, reading them the way he read water and sky. More than one person. They would arrive by midday. He adjusted nothing. That, too, was part of what he had learned. When discovery was unavoidable, it was best to let things be seen as they were meant to be seen. He left the shed as it appeared, crooked, weathered, unremarkable. He did not hide his tools. He did not clean his hands. He waited. The men came in a small group, 3 at first, then 2 more trailing behind. Among them was the owner. The boy recognized his walk before he recognized his face. It carried the same distracted certainty it always had. "Well," the owner said when he spotted the boy near the shed. "I'll be." The boy stood slowly and lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." Another man frowned. "You said the land wouldn't keep him." "So I did," the owner replied. "Seems I was wrong." They approached cautiously, as if the land itself might object. One man circled the shed, tapping a board with his boot. "This been here long?" The boy nodded. "Since before me." "Still standing?" The man muttered. They expected weakness. That much was clear. They expected a boy barely clinging to life, perhaps ill, perhaps half mad from isolation. What they found instead unsettled them, though none of them named the feeling. The boy stood thin, yes, but steady. His eyes were clear. His posture, though modest, held balance. Nothing about him suggested collapse. "You been alone all this time?" one man asked. "Yes, sir." "No help?" "No, sir." A silence followed. They began to notice things without understanding them. The ground near the shed was firmer than expected. Water pooled away from the door. Paths existed where none should have. Not wide paths. Nothing obvious, but enough that movement was possible without sinking. "Looks like you've been busy," someone said. The boy shrugged slightly. "I did what I could." The owner studied him more closely now, eyes narrowing. "You didn't run?" "No, sir." "Why not?" The question hung in the air longer than any before it. The boy answered carefully. "Didn't see the sense." One of the men laughed, but it was uneasy. "Hear that? Didn't see the sense." They walked the parcel, their boots no longer confident. They tested the ground. They followed the subtle channels without realizing they were doing so. The land did not betray the boy's work, but it did not hide it either. It simply functioned. "That storm last month," one man said. "Water rose higher than I've seen." The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." "And you stayed?" "Yes, sir." They exchanged glances. No one praised him. Praise would have required acknowledgement. Instead, they spoke in practical terms. Of labor, of reassignment, of whether the boy might be of use elsewhere now. "Stronger than he looks," one said quietly. The boy kept his eyes down. They did not ask how he learned. They did not ask what he endured. Such questions carried responsibility, and responsibility was something they preferred not to collect. But something had shifted. The owner cleared his throat. "We'll have you move closer in. Don't want to waste what's left of the season." The boy felt the words settle inside him, heavy and final. "Yes, sir," he said. As they prepared to leave, one of the men lingered near the shed. He ran his hand along the patched tin roof, then withdrew it slowly. "Kid," he said, not unkindly, "how old are you really?" The boy hesitated. Not long, but long enough to remind himself who he was speaking to. I don't rightly know, sir. The man nodded as if that answered more than it concealed. When they left, the land grew quiet again. The boy stood alone, listening to the retreating sound of boots until it vanished entirely. Only then did he sit on the stool inside the shed. He had survived their return. More than that, he had unsettled them. They had come expecting absence, loss, proof that their neglect had been justified. Instead, they found evidence of order where none was meant to exist, of patience where desperation should have taken hold. They did not know what to call it. That night, the boy touched the scratched marks on the shed post, his map of storms and time. He did not erase them. He did not add to them. A chapter had ended. Whatever came next would be different. Closer eyes, shorter distances, less silence, but he had learned something valuable. Even when people returned, they often saw only what fit their expectations, and when expectations failed, they rarely looked deeper. Confusion, he knew, was another kind of cover. As the wind moved through the reeds one last time, the boy lay down and rested. He had endured alone. And in doing so, he had changed the way they looked at him, without ever asking them to. They moved him closer to the main fields at the start of autumn, not into the house, not into the center of attention, just close enough to be seen now and then, close enough that his continued existence no longer felt improbable. The low parcel was left behind, reclaimed by water and reeds, returning to its forgotten state as if he had never been there at all. But he carried it with him. At first, the others did not know what to make of him. He worked quietly, kept his eyes lowered, spoke only when spoken to. He did not rush, yet his tasks were finished. He did not ask for help, yet he did not falter. When tools broke, they were mended. When instructions were vague, they were followed exactly as given, no more, no less. People noticed without meaning to. He's steady, someone said once, not as praise, but as observation. Doesn't complain. Another added. That one listens, an older man murmured, watching him from a distance. The boy learned quickly that survival now required a different shape. In the low parcel, invisibility had protected him. Here, quiet reliability did. He adjusted as he always had, altering himself to the space he occupied, leaving no sharp edges for notice to catch on. Still, something followed him. It was not kindness. It was not respect, not fully. It was a pause in voices when he passed, a hesitation before orders were given, a sense that he was not what he appeared to be, though no one could say why. They did not ask where he had learned patience like that. They did not ask how he knew when storms were coming. They did not ask how a boy once sold as weak had lasted alone where grown men would not. Instead, they filled the silence with guesses. Some folks are just made for endurance. One said, land didn't finish him. Another replied, that's something. The boy listened and said nothing. He understood now that reputation could be as dangerous as neglect. Being thought capable invited use. Being thought exceptional invited scrutiny. He walked a careful line between the two, never doing more than required, never less than expected. At night, when work ended and voices softened, he lay awake and listened to the sounds of others sleeping nearby. The land here spoke differently. It was louder, less honest. Human noise masked the small warnings he had learned to trust. He missed the silence. Sometimes in the early morning before others rose, he remembered the low parcel. The way fog lifted slowly from the water. The way birds announced the day before light arrived. The way time had belonged only to him and the land. Those memories were sharp, but not painful. They had shaped him. They still did. Once, a younger boy was sent to work near him. The child moved too fast, spoke too much, tired quickly. When the boy stumbled into soft ground and panicked, the older boy reached out and steadied him without a word, guiding his feet back to firmness. How'd you know? the child whispered. The boy only shook his head. Watch first. That was all he said. Years passed. Seasons folded into one another. The boy grew older in small, unremarkable ways. His shoulders broadened slightly. His hands hardened. His face remained quiet. People stopped guessing at his age. He was there when work needed doing, gone when it did not. He learned to carry his past without displaying it. The low parcel faded from conversation, then from memory, until it existed only as a vague warning. Bad land, useless land, not worth sending anyone to again. No one spoke his name in connection with it, and that, he understood, was the final shape of survival, to endure something so completely that it no longer needed to be explained. Sometimes, when storms came and rain pressed against the buildings, he would pause in his work and listen. The sound still told him what it always had, how long it would last, how hard it would fall, when it would pass. He never shared this knowledge. It was enough to carry it. In quiet moments, when the world seemed to narrow to breath and memory, he thought of the marks on the shed post. The scratches counting water lines and days. They were gone now, softened by weather, erased by time. No record remained. But he remembered. He remembered the land that had tested him without mercy and taught him without words. He remembered the silence that had kept him alive. He remembered being sold as broken and learning instead how to remain unbroken by never announcing his strength. And as years moved forward, leaving no written trace of him behind, the boy understood something few ever did, that survival does not always demand escape. Sometimes it demands stillness, sometimes it demands silence, and sometimes it leaves behind nothing at all, except a life that continues quietly, where no one thought it would.